The cold, metallic clang of the cage door shutting echoed through the dark chamber. The room smelled like dampness, decay, and fear. A faint light flickered overhead, casting long, eerie shadows on the stone walls. Inside the cage, a girl sat on the ground, her back against the wall. Her arms were chained tightly to the bars, and her eyes stared ahead, fixed and unblinking. She was motionless, as if lost in thought, but anyone who looked closely would have seen the small tremor in her hands. For years, she had been locked away in this place, an abandoned, forgotten prison deep beneath the surface of a distant planet. The authorities called her dangerous, a threat to everything they had worked to build. They didn't understand her. They never had. And that was exactly why she was here, in this cold, solitary confinement. The soldiers had always been quick to label her a monster, just like the creatures that were kept with her, around her. They thought she was like the others, but they had no idea what she really was. The girl closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of the guards walking above her. Their footsteps were heavy, echoing down the long hallways, but they had no idea what was really happening below. She had heard their whispers, the rumors of the beasts that were kept in cages like hers. Monsters, they called them. Terrifying, unnatural creatures that were said to be capable of wiping out entire cities with a single attack. She had been told they were nothing but savage beasts, dangerous and uncontrollable. They were wrong. Because the truth was, she wasn't the prisoner here. The creatures, the monsters, those were the ones who were truly locked away. A faint grin curled at the corner of her lips, though her eyes remained focused. She had waited long enough. The day was coming when everything would change. The day when they would see the truth. Her chains rattled slightly as she stood up, her feet making no sound on the cold stone floor. She was no longer the scared girl who had been dragged here years ago. She had grown stronger, learned more than they ever thought possible. Her body had been confined, but her mind had expanded. She had unlocked parts of herself that no one could have predicted. And then, from the shadows of her cell, a low growl echoed, soft at first, like a whisper, but then louder, deeper. The growl was not from her own throat. It came from the dark corners of the cage. The creatures. They were still here, waiting, watching. The girl's smile widened. They knew it was time. The prison was surrounded by darkness, and the only thing that could be heard now was the sound of the creatures shifting in the shadows. They were quiet, patient, as if they understood what was happening. Her heart beat in rhythm with theirs, connected by something deeper than mere survival. It was instinct. It was fate. The monsters outside her cage, those that the humans feared, were not the mindless beasts they had thought. No, they were something else entirely. And they weren't the only ones who could learn. The girl could control them. She had always been able to. The creatures listened to her, obeyed her, even when they could not understand her. They were bound by an ancient force, something older than the humans could ever comprehend, and she was their link to that power. A sharp sound echoed through the corridor outside her cell. Footsteps. The guards were coming. They were too late. The girl took a deep breath, standing tall now. The shadows moved in unison with her, a creeping wave of darkness that seemed to follow her every step. She turned toward the door of the cage, the heavy steel bars standing in her way. But she wasn't worried. She had learned to control the darkness, and the monsters, her monsters, were ready to fight. The sound of the guards grew louder, their voices muffled as they spoke to one another. "Keep it quiet," one of them said. "We don't want her to know we're coming." They thought she was helpless. They thought they had control. But they were wrong. They had no idea what she was capable of. She wasn't the scared, trembling girl who had been thrown into this cage years ago. She was something else now. With a soft whisper of a command, the girl's eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. The air shifted around her. The creatures stirred. There was a sudden bang as the door to her cell flew open, the guards stepping inside. The light from their torches flickered briefly in the doorway. illuminating the girl's face. But before they could react, before they could even take a step, a shape leaped from the shadows. Something massive, with claws like knives and teeth, sharp enough to rip through metal. The guards screamed as the creature tore into them. The girl didn't move. She simply watched, her expression unreadable. The creatures had never been monsters. They were her companions, her protectors. They were the ones who had kept her alive all this time, who had fought alongside her in the shadows. The humans had never seen them for what they truly were. And now, the humans would understand. They would understand that she was not the prisoner. She was the monster. The last guard tried to raise his weapon, but it was already too late. The creatures had finished their work, leaving only blood and broken bodies in their wake. The girl stood up from her spot in the cage, her chains still clinking as they fell to the floor. She didn't need them anymore. She had no use for chains. With a final glance toward the dead soldiers, she stepped over their bodies, her heart racing with anticipation. This was just the beginning. The humans had only seen a glimpse of her power, but now she would show them everything. The real war had just begun. The girl stepped over the fallen bodies of the guards, her bare feet making no sound as she moved through the chaos. The stench of blood filled the air, but she didn't flinch. The creatures, once thought to be wild, savage beasts, circled her now, their eyes glowing in the dim light. They were not just animals. They were her allies, her protectors. The soldiers had never understood that. They thought they could control the creatures, thought they could lock her away and contain her power. But now, they saw how wrong they were. She walked through the carnage, her mind sharp, calculating. There was still more to do. The entire complex was built to hold prisoners like her, to contain threats they didn't understand, and they had made the mistake of underestimating her. As she made her way deeper into the prison, the corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, but she had memorized every inch of this place. The walls whispered secrets, and she knew how to listen. It wasn't just the monsters that made her dangerous. It was her ability to see through the lies, to see the flaws in their systems. The air grew colder as she approached the control room. She could hear the murmurs of more soldiers ahead, their voices tight with fear. They had been informed of the breach, and now they were preparing to fight back. They had no idea what they were up against. The girl could feel her heart beating faster, not from fear, but from the excitement of what was to come. She had waited years for this moment, for the chance to take control. She signaled to the creatures around her, and they responded immediately, their eyes flicking to her every movement. There was no need for words. They knew her as well as she knew them. They had been with her all this time, and now they would help her free herself and bring chaos to those who had imprisoned her. The monsters weren't the ones who needed to be controlled anymore. The soldiers would learn that quickly. As she reached the corner of the hall leading to the control room, she paused. She could hear the voices clearer now, a few officers discussing the security measures. They thought they were in control. They thought the guards they had stationed could hold her off. They didn't realize how quickly everything was about to change. She moved silently, like a shadow, the monsters following her without hesitation. One step closer. The final door loomed ahead, and with a single motion, she gave the signal. The creatures surged forward, crashing into the control room before the officers could react. The chaos was instantaneous. Screams echoed off the walls, and the sound of gunfire rang through the hall. But the girl remained calm, her eyes focused on the command center ahead. The monsters tore through the soldiers, overwhelming them in a matter of seconds. It wasn't even a fight. It was a slaughter. She could feel the power surging through her, the connection between her and the creatures deepening as they attacked. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She was no longer the prisoner. She was the one in control. As the last of the soldiers fell, the girl stepped into the command center, her eyes scanning the room. There were no more guards, just terrified officers, their faces pale as they realized what had just happened. One man, dressed in a high-ranking uniform, stood frozen in place, his eyes wide with disbelief. He was the leader, the one who had given the orders, the one who had sentenced her to this hell. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Did you think I was just a prisoner?" The girl's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a coldness that sent shivers down the officer's spine. She stepped forward, her eyes never leaving his. "Did you think you could lock me away and forget about me? That I was just some wild animal?" She smiled slightly, the expression chilling in its intensity. "You were wrong." The officer didn't say anything. He couldn't. He was too terrified. He had spent years believing she was nothing but a threat, a monster to be contained. But he didn't know the truth. She was more than that. She had never been a prisoner. She had always been the one pulling the strings. With a flick of her wrist, the creatures growled softly, and the officer stumbled back, his face pale with fear. He realized then that he was no longer in control. She was. And the monsters had come to make sure of it. The girl stood there, surveying the wreckage, the bodies of the soldiers, the officers cowering before her. This was only the beginning. The galaxy had no idea what was coming for them. They had underestimated her, and now they would feel the consequences. The girl was no longer just a prisoner. She was a force, an unstoppable one, and she had just begun her conquest. The girl moved through the wreckage of the command center, her footsteps light and deliberate. The sounds of panicked officers echoed around her, but she remained focused, her gaze sharp and calculating. Her monsters, her protectors, had cleared the area, leaving only destruction in their wake. The prisoners of the facility, those who had once been imprisoned alongside her, were free now. But the girl wasn't here for them. She had come for something far greater. As the last of the soldiers in the control room scrambled to their feet, she moved toward the central console. The woman's fingers brushed lightly over the terminal, her mind already working through the security codes she had memorized over the years. She could almost feel the hum of the system beneath her fingertips. The machines had never been her enemies. The real enemies had always been the ones who thought they could control her. She wasn't just going to escape. She was going to make them regret ever locking her away. With a soft beep, the screen flickered to life. She smiled slightly. It was easy. Too easy. The entire facility's security was nothing more than a series of old algorithms, outdated, predictable, just like the people who had built it. A low growl echoed from the shadows behind her. One of the creatures stepped forward, its massive form blocking the door. The soldiers had been far too distracted with their own survival to notice that the girl had already released the prisoners, those whose lives had been stolen by the government years ago. They would fight alongside her now, but she had a bigger plan in mind. Her fingers danced across the console, entering command after command, deactivating systems, unlocking doors, and overriding safety protocols. The monitors around her flickered, each display showing the same thing. An empty hallway, a quiet facility that was quickly turning into chaos. The girl's mind raced, going over the events that had led to this moment. She was no longer the terrified girl they had locked away. She had learned to survive, to adapt, to become something they could never have anticipated. Her connection to the creatures, the monsters they thought were mindless, had become something much deeper. They weren't just beasts. They were symbiotic allies. As the last door in the control room slid open, the girl turned toward the leader. The officer who had once ordered her capture, the one who had forced her into the cage with the monsters, was still standing there. He was shaking now, pale, eyes wide with horror as he watched his world crumble around him. The girl could feel the fear radiating from him. But there was something else there too, a realization. He had underestimated her, and now he was about to pay the price. "Do you understand now?" The girl's voice was calm, cold even, as she walked toward him. "You locked me away with the monsters, but you didn't realize who the real monster was." The officer opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He was no longer in control. The girl had taken that from him. With a single gesture, she called forth her creatures. They materialized from the shadows, their eyes glowing with a hunger for revenge. The officer could only watch as the beasts surrounded him. He was trapped, outnumbered, and powerless. "You thought you could control me," she whispered, "but you were wrong. You didn't even know what you were dealing with." The officer opened his mouth again, but this time there were no more words. The creatures moved in, swift and terrifying, and within moments, the man was gone. Nothing but a few blood-stained remnants of his uniform left behind. The girl stood still, watching, her expression unreadable. She wasn't doing this out of cruelty. She wasn't taking pleasure in the destruction. This was something much larger. This was about reclaiming what had been stolen from her, about showing the galaxy that she was no longer the victim. She had never been the victim. The monsters, her monsters, circled around her now, their growls softened, as if they were waiting for her next command. She gave a small, satisfied nod. The room was quiet once again. She turned back to the control console and glanced at the readout. It was all falling into place. The gates had been unlocked. The doors to the outer compound were wide open. She was no longer confined by their walls. Now, the entire facility would be hers. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The girl's eyes gleamed with something more than vengeance. There was a fire in her now, a need to show the universe that humanity's war machines, their systems of control, their governments, were nothing compared to what she had become. She wasn't just a girl locked in a cage with monsters. She was a force of nature, unstoppable and untouchable. The galaxy would tremble before her. With one final glance at the control room, she turned toward the open doors. Her monsters followed, as they always did. Her journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. The girl walked through the halls of the facility with newfound purpose. The once imposing walls that had held her captive now felt like nothing more than a distant memory. With each step, her confidence grew. She wasn't just a prisoner anymore. She was the conqueror. The air felt heavier now, not with fear, but with power. The monsters that had been locked away with her, feared by those who didn't understand them, had become her allies. Together, they were unstoppable. The distant sounds of alarms blared through the facility, but the girl hardly noticed. She knew it was only a matter of time before the outside world realized what was happening. The humans who had thought they could control her, contain her, were now learning the hard truth. Their fortress was crumbling from the inside out. She could hear the sounds of soldiers scrambling, but there was no point in trying to fight back. She was already too far ahead. As she moved toward the central command hub, her mind raced. There was no more running, no more hiding. This was her moment to take everything back, to reshape the balance of power. The humans had locked her away, thinking they could control her, but they never realized what she was truly capable of. They had underestimated the very thing they feared. The girl reached the large steel doors of the central hub and stopped. She could hear voices on the other side. Panic-filled voices as the officers realized that their security systems had been breached. The screens flickered and buzzed. They were trying to regain control, but it was too late. Without a second thought, she stepped forward, her hand resting on the door panel. She didn't need to look at the controls. She had already memorized the layout of the facility. Her mind, now sharper and more aware than it had ever been, knew exactly what to do. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and she stepped into the room. The command hub was chaos. Officers ran in all directions, shouting orders, but it was clear they were panicking. The girl didn't care about their commands. She had one goal: the control systems. "Stop her," one of the officers shouted. He was younger than most, probably someone who had just recently been assigned to this facility. His voice cracked with fear, and his hand hovered over a blaster, but he didn't move. He had seen what had happened to the guards. His hesitation cost him. Before he could react, one of the monsters, the largest one, leaped toward him. Its claws sliced through the air with deadly precision, knocking the officer to the ground in a single swipe. His scream echoed as he was dragged into the shadows, never to be heard from again. The girl didn't flinch. She continued to walk forward, her eyes locked on the control panel at the far end of the room. It was heavily guarded, but there was no force on this planet, no army, no system, that could stop her now. She had waited too long. The systems hummed as she approached, but the girl knew they weren't working. They were already compromised. With a small motion, she gestured to the creatures, and they moved, circling the room, clearing out anyone who might pose a threat. The remaining officers had nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. As the monsters swiftly took care of them, the girl reached the control panel and pressed her fingers against the cold glass. She was silent, still, as if she were listening to something far beyond the sounds of the battle unfolding around her. Then, without warning, the entire facility's systems flickered. The power went out, leaving everything bathed in darkness for a brief, haunting moment. When the lights returned, everything was different. The screens showed the faces of soldiers and officers in panic, but they no longer held any authority. The girl had taken control. Locking down the compound, she muttered to herself. A smile tugged at the corner of her lips as she keyed in the final override. The facility was hers now. The girl turned toward the door, her monsters trailing behind her like loyal shadows. The facility was silent, except for the low growls of the creatures that had freed her. There was nothing left for the soldiers to do. They could only watch as she and her monsters moved through the hallways, methodically clearing the path of those who had dared to imprison her. But this was not just about revenge. This was about more than showing them what she could do. This was about something larger. The girl had become a symbol, a living, breathing force that could never be contained. The monsters weren't just her weapons. They were her allies, her equals. She wasn't just a survivor of the horrors they'd put her through. She was their ruler. As she walked through the now empty halls, the girl couldn't help but wonder what would come next. The humans were weak. They had spent so long hiding behind walls, behind technology, thinking they were safe from the unknown. But the girl had learned the truth. The real monsters had always been the ones who thought they were in control. The creatures who had been feared in cage were now free. But the girl knew they weren't the only ones who had been caged. The entire galaxy had been living in its own prison, trapped by its own systems, its own rules. Now she was the one who held the keys. The girl didn't look back as she reached the main entrance, her creatures following closely behind her. The sun was rising over the horizon outside, painting the sky in hues of red and orange. It was the beginning of a new era, an era where the real monsters ruled. The girl smiled, knowing the battle was far from over. This was only the start of her reign. And no one was going to stop her now. The silence in the facility was now absolute. There were no more screams, no more gunshots. The only sounds were the distant growls of the creatures that now walked alongside the girl, their steps heavy but deliberate. She moved through the halls with ease, her mind sharp, calculating. Every step she took was one closer to her ultimate goal. She knew that this was just the beginning. The battle for control had only just started. As she walked through the corridors, her thoughts drifted to the outside world. The galaxy had no idea what had just happened. The human forces, those who had imprisoned her, who had believed themselves to be safe behind their walls, had no idea what was coming. The girl wasn't just another prisoner. She wasn't someone they could lock away and forget. She was a force to be reckoned with, and now the rest of the galaxy would learn that. She stopped in front of a large observation window that overlooked the facility's landing bay. Ships of various sizes were parked below, awaiting orders, ready to leave. But not anymore. The girl looked out across the bay, a feeling of calm washing over her. This was hers now. The ships, the weapons, the technology, they were all part of the arsenal she needed to take the next step. With a single motion, she raised her hand. The creatures behind her seemed to react instinctively, their eyes glowing as they turned toward the window. The girl could feel their connection, a bond deeper than anything the humans had ever understood. The monsters weren't just tools for her revenge. They were her allies, her army. Together, they were unstoppable. She had already given the order. The ships were locked down, their systems overridden. The doors to the bay slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the massive fleet of human warships parked below. It had taken years for the humans to build this fleet, and yet it was now hers under her command. The once powerful weapons of destruction were now her instruments of war. The girl smiled as the realization hit her. The galaxy had no idea what it had just awakened. Her mind raced with possibilities. The ships in the bay were only the beginning. The girl could already see the future unfolding before her. The galaxy was vast, filled with species that had thought they were untouchable. But no one would be safe from her reach. No one would be able to hide from the girl and her monsters. But there was something else, something more important. The girl wasn't just going to destroy everything in her path. No, she had a greater purpose. She had to show the galaxy who she was. She had to show them the true power of the monsters. They weren't just mindless creatures. They had been the ones who had kept her alive, who had protected her through the years of isolation and pain. They had been the ones who had helped her survive. And now, they would help her conquer. With a signal, she activated the ship's engines. The massive warships hummed to life, their weapons systems powering up. The sound of them firing into the atmosphere was deafening. But the girl didn't flinch. She had control. She had power. But even as the warships launched into the sky, the girl knew that her enemies weren't just going to sit back and let her take over. There would be forces, armies, governments that would try to stop her. They would rally against her. They would try to fight her, to destroy her. But the girl had no doubt. She had spent too long in their cages to fear them now. One of the creatures stepped forward. Its eyes locked on the girl. She gave a small nod. The creature was her trusted companion, her right hand. Together, they had been through so much, and now they would face whatever came next. The girl knew she wasn't alone anymore. The monsters were her family, and together they would crush anyone who stood in their way. As the girl turned away from the observation window and moved toward the open doors of the command center, her resolve was stronger than ever. The galaxy had no idea what was coming. They would soon learn that the girl they had locked away was no longer the prisoner. She was the ruler. And the galaxy was about to find out that when you lock a monster in a cage, you don't just create an enemy. You create a nightmare. She didn't need to say a word. The monsters knew exactly what was coming. They had waited long enough. And now, they would lead the charge. The warships in the distance powered through the skies, massive forms cutting through the atmosphere with terrifying precision. The girl stood at the helm of the largest ship in the fleet, her hands lightly gripping the control panel. Her eyes remained calm, fixed on the endless expanse of stars ahead. The battlefield was before her, but the girl wasn't worried. This was her moment. The time had come for the galaxy to learn that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology, it was her. The ship shook slightly as it ascended higher, and she felt the familiar hum beneath her feet. It was the same hum she had felt all her life, the vibrations that resonated deep within her bones. The warships were her new domain. The creatures, the monsters, had always been her allies, and now she controlled an army that could rival the greatest empires in the galaxy. The fear that had once gripped her was gone, replaced by an unshakable confidence. Her monsters were with her, as always. They moved through the corridors of the ship like shadows, ever watchful, ever loyal. Their presence was comforting, yet dangerous. They had been her companions for so long, and now they were her army. The girl glanced toward the command center, where the remaining officers of the facility, those who had escaped the initial chaos, cowered. They were the ones who had once believed they could control her, but now they were nothing more than pawns in her game. A soft voice crackled through the communication system. It was a familiar voice, one that sent a thrill through her chest. "General, we're receiving a transmission from the outer sectors. They've detected our fleet. The other military forces are on their way." The girl's lips curled into a smile. The galactic forces, those that had once looked down on her, were rushing to stop her. They thought they could put a stop to the nightmare she had become. But they had no idea what they were truly up against. "Let them come," the girl said coldly. Her voice was calm, but there was a fire in it that couldn't be ignored. "Prepare for battle. We will show them what happens when they underestimate us." The girl turned her gaze to the vast expanse of space beyond the ship's viewports. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. Strategies, plans, contingencies. But one thing was clear. She was not just a girl anymore. She was a symbol, a living nightmare, and she was about to prove it. The ships in her fleet began to take formation, their engines roaring as they synchronized with deadly precision. Each ship was a force unto itself, a well-oiled machine ready to tear through anything in its path. The girl could feel the power of the fleet as it aligned with her will. These ships weren't just tools, they were extensions of her own fury. Together, they would shatter the resistance. As the enemy fleet approached, the first signs of conflict began to unfold. The girl observed the battle from the bridge. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the incoming ships, their aggressive formations beginning to take shape. These were the elite military forces of the galaxy, trained to handle the most dangerous of adversaries. But none of their tactics, none of their training, could have prepared them for what they were about to face. The first shot was fired. An enemy ship launched a barrage of plasma missiles in her direction. The missiles streaked through the black void of space, aiming to tear apart the flagship. But the girl's fleet was faster. With a series of quick, precise maneuvers, the flagship evaded the attack with ease. The girl's hands flew over the controls, and she issued a command. The massive warship retaliated instantly. Its cannons fired in unison, sending out a volley of energy blasts that tore through the incoming missiles before they could get close. The power behind the shot was enough to rattle even the most seasoned space pilots. The enemy fleet was beginning to realize the magnitude of what they were facing. They had expected an easy victory, an unruly girl with a few monsters at her side. But what they didn't understand was that she wasn't just any girl. She was humanity's most dangerous weapon. She had been locked away in a cage with monsters, but now she had become the monster they should have feared all along. As the battle raged on, the girl's fleet pushed forward. Her monsters, unleashed in full force, wreaked havoc on enemy ships. The creatures climbed over the hulls of massive warships, their claws slicing through reinforced steel as if it were paper. There was no escape. Every enemy ship that tried to retreat found itself pursued, overwhelmed by the girl's war machines and monstrous allies. The tide of battle was shifting in her favor. On the bridge, the girl remained calm, her eyes focused on the main screen as she observed the chaos unfolding outside. She could see the fear on the faces of the commanders from the enemy fleet. They were no longer confident. They were no longer sure of their victory. They had made a fatal mistake, underestimating the girl, the monsters, and the humanity they had once thought they could control. The girl's fingers hovered over the communication system. She was ready to issue the final command, the one that would end the battle and solidify her rule. With a calm, unflinching voice, she spoke into the comms, addressing both her fleet and the enemy forces. "Your time is up," she said, her voice carrying through the galaxy. "You never understood who you were dealing with. You thought I was just a prisoner. But now you will understand. This is my galaxy, and you will kneel before me." As her words echoed through the vast expanse of space, the final waves of her fleet advanced, their weapons ready for the last strike. The enemies that had dared to challenge her were about to learn the hard way. Humanity's most terrifying weapon was no longer a girl locked in a cage. She was the one who would control the stars. With a final blast, the remaining enemy ships were obliterated, and the girl's fleet emerged victorious. The galaxy would never be the same again. She had proven her dominance, her power, and her revenge. The girl who had been imprisoned who had been underestimated, was now the ruler of the stars.